All right, everybody. As you all know, I am quite the weed smoker. More specifically, a weed vapor. I'm actually much more. I can't really handle burning or like smoke in my lungs, or like I can't stand the flavor. I can't stand the taste or the charriness or the like amount of harshness there is to it. I just don't like it. It's not a pleasurable way of getting stoned. And I like getting stoned to be a pleasurable experience that I enjoy, which is why I've gotten much more into these concentrate vapes, and I go for like the highest concentration power of concentrate that I can get, and I get some pretty good stuff. I'm in Washington State, Seattle to be more specific, and the weed that we got here is very, very good. I'm a big fan of Washington weed. That said, weed is not legal everywhere. In fact, federal legalization of weed does not seem like it's quite achievable, even for a while into the future, any time in the foreseeable future, which is a big problem. Federal legalization is what is the most necessary for the marijuana industry to evolve from this point on. There are a few inequalities and issues with the industry of legal weed currently that need to be addressed due to this issue. For starters, lack of federal legalization of weed means that federal banks cannot issue loans to people who want to start a dispensary or a weed-based business. It's illegal for them to do so because it's only state legal, not federally legal. So as you can imagine, considering that to start a dispensary, even in legal states, you have to already have the capital needed to invest in starting the business out of pocket, what do you think that's going to lead to? I'll tell you. It leads to a massive disparity racially between like dispensary owners. Most of them are white. Very few black dispensary owners. Which sounds very unfair when you consider the fact that marijuana legalization was in large part supposed to solve the problem of black people being more heavily policed and prosecuted for marijuana or marijuana possession and marijuana related crimes than white people. And yet the dispensaries are mostly white owned because of this issue, even in the states where weed is legal. This is one of many issues that has come along with the lack of federal legalization that affects even the legal states, which is why we can't just rely on the blue states, the progressive states having the right position on this, and the red states doing whatever the fuck they want. Because until it is federally legalized, even the blue states' legal weed is going to be hampered. That said, we're going to get really stoned, and we're going to be watching a Vox video called A Fact-Checked Debate About Legal Weed. Because I haven't seen anything like this before, and I'm actually curious to see. We've got obviously someone who's against legal weed, I guess, and someone who's for it, and they're going to be debating, and it's going to be fact-checked. So if someone lies or says something that's wrong, it's going to be called out. And I really like that. I like fact-check debates. That's actually pretty dope. So let's take a look. And of course, if you have weed on hand, be prepared to get nice and stoned.
Sounds like you want to treat it like a legal product.
Or a better way forward, which is just decriminalize it.
This looks like a debate,
It's legal.
That's not true.
but it's not. Yes, these two advocates fundamentally disagree about a major policy issue.
I support the legalization and regulation of cannabis for adults.
I oppose legalization of cannabis.
We could have just had them show up and fight it out. That's how these things usually go.
No, I think
But when you watch people argue, are you judging content or style? And how do you know if they're even
Good point. Wait, I didn't expect a Vox video to make this point. But yeah, very good point. I've said this many times, but if you're in any way, like, experienced with, like, the sphere of online debate, most of it, like, is based on who won is based on who made their arguments look the best, not who is correct. This is just objectively true. The person who won a debate is not the person who held the correct position. If that was the case, then every lefty would win every debate with every conservative by default. The problem is, conservatives specifically, due to the fact that what they believe in is false and wrong and morally bankrupt, they have to find very, very compelling and creative ways to wrap up their rhetoric in a seemingly believable and sort of understandable veneer.
Even telling the truth.
So in a debate format like this, as I should say, a debate format like this literally makes that impossible, because someone's going to be coming in and saying, actually, it's not true. Your little rhetorical bit you tried to do there, that's bullshit. It's not actually, it's not actually true. You just lied.
So we wanted to try something different. We asked both Paul and Will to send us 5 facts about cannabis legalization that their opponent would have to concede are true. They fact-checked each other, we fact-checked them too. And after going back and forth on the exact phrasing, we landed on 6.
Do you both agree that these are true?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
They'll each present their facts and get to respond to the other's facts with a footnote. Okay, here we go.
Could you imagine if every online debate was moderated this well? That would be insane. But conservatives would immediately stop agreeing to debates like this. This is not a good idea if you are right-wing. You cannot back up a conservative worldview with reality. But who knows? Maybe the anti-weed guy isn't
National
conservative.
polls consistently show that a majority of the American public support legalizing marijuana. In 1969, a minority supported legalization. Today, it's nearly 70%. As more states have adopted legalization, support among the public has risen in parallel. There's no buyer's remorse.
My footnote to that would
True, nobody has buyer's remorse about legal weed.
be these polls often give what we believe is to be a false dichotomy of choice. If I have to choose between arrest and incarceration or legalization, I'm going to choose legalization as well. But when we dig a little bit deeper, and there's some national polls.
So he's against weed being available as a product. He thinks the idea of there being dispensaries and whatnot is bad. So I don't know if you know this, but dispensaries are taxed very heavily. They are a massive source of income for the states in which they exist. They tax income that can be used to invest back into projects to help the state and its population. That is a dumb argument, okay? No, he opposes government regulation, I think. So he doesn't believe in government regulation, thus there shouldn't be legalized weed because the government will regulate it? Is he like a super Okay, I have to hear what this guy's premise is first.
Choice. If I have to choose between arrest and incarceration or legalization, I'm going to choose legalization as well. But when we dig a little bit deeper, and there's some national polls from Emerson that show that support for legalization falls well below 50% when people are presented with other options, such as decriminalization and the medicinal use of the cannabis plant.
Well, let's talk about those polls, Will. Even when you provide more choices, the most popular choice is legalizing marijuana by adults.
That is true. And that rate's only going up with Gen Z.
My name is Will Jones. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Outreach at Smart Approaches to Marijuana. I really believe that we can explore better policy options when it comes to marijuana policy than either criminalization or commercialization. Decriminalization removes
I'm sorry, but policy, as in like any laws or restrictions, is not going to help. If your concern is that marijuana... Okay. My concern as a stoner in regards to marijuana is people under the age of 21 getting access to weed. I don't think that's good. And I don't think that should be a thing. I also don't think people under the age of 21 should be getting access to nicotine as someone who vapes. The problem here is that banning the sale of these things, especially on a state level, does not eliminate the problem. All it does is create more roadblocks and more danger for those that are going to bypass whatever roadblocks you make, to get access to it. If you think after the California flavored vape ban, there aren't Zoomers that are buying their vapes from weirdos who come to like the parking lot a few blocks away from the high school and like sell vapes from out of state or something, Like, if you think that's not happening still and they're not paying more and having to talk to even shadier, weirder dudes, oh, it's still happening. In Australia, high school is where you meet dealers. It's insane. Maybe it's even at the high school. Yeah, wouldn't be surprising. I've heard about vape selling happening in bathrooms. It won't solve the problem. It'll just mean that these kids spend more money on it, and they'll be more desperate for it. And the kids that go through withdrawals, oh, I guarantee you're going to see kids going through withdrawals in school, and it's not going to lead to any positive outcome. The fact is that unless the policy is referring to as a solution is policy to create programs that allow kids that maybe, like, let's be honest, weed does have negative effects on your body. You can develop a mental dependency on it very easily if it becomes a habit. You can develop, if you start using weed too early, there is undeniable evidence that weed, if used too early in life at a habitual rate, can have severe impacts on your mental development in a negative way and stunt it. That is not good. Weed also, and every stoner knows this, can have the effect of heavily pushing back your motivation and drive to do things. Obviously, I'm more of a sativa guy. My strain on my body has the effect of kind of putting me into robot mode and allowing me to just kind of grind my work out without really, it just chills me out, and I just grind out my work. But a lot of people, they smoke weed, makes them lazy, makes them just lay back and just kind of sink into the couch. Sometimes it's just how their body responds to weed. Maybe it's because that's the strain they're using. And maybe sometimes it's just how weed works for them. Weed affects different people differently, right? However, it is unanimously known that if you're not careful with your weed consumption, all of these negative impacts can affect you and many more. The problem is, I don't think that any form of prohibition or prohibition light is the solution to this. I think that responsible education is the best solution to this. DARE campaigns have been proven to be the worst fucking way to go about this, besides criminalization and prohibition. But I think doing more realistic education about drugs is the best way to do this. Decriminalizing and educating in a way that is not meant to fearmonger, but to genuinely educate. I really do think that a proper education about weed, for example, at a school would be, honestly, a lot of you watching right now, by the time you're a senior in high school, you're going to be a habitual weed smoker. That's just the fact of it. That is just statistically the fact of it. You are going to smoke weed regularly. A lot of you that are in this crowd right now, I'm imagining the assemblies I would go to as a kid. I'd be like, a lot of you kids, by the time you're in high school, you're going to be smoking marijuana pretty regularly. It's going to end up that way. Don't know how, you don't know how, but it'll just end up that way. But here's the reality of it. If that does end up being what you end up doing, you need to know how to go about it responsibly. And I think that schools should give a talk about what it's like to have to deal with drug dealers, to have to deal with potential, obviously a realistic and not a fear-mongering explanation of what it's like to have to, buy drugs, what it's like when you run out of drugs, like weed, for example, and you want weed, and it's oh shit, the guy I buy my weed from isn't there. He won't answer. No, I've got no weed and there's no one to buy weed from. And I'm fucked. Just realistic explanations that are more likely to deter someone from weed than some fear-mongered made-up propaganda. How many people do you think, how many real stories as a stoner do you think you have about times where you wish you'd never started smoking weed because you're oh, I wish I had weed right now? That if you told those stories, you feel they'd be a better, it'd have a better effect than a DARE campaign. I've got a few. Yeah, running out of weed is one of the worst things that can ever happen to you. Explain to kids what it's like to run out of weed once you start smoking weed. That's a good deterrent.
Penalties for the personal possession and use of marijuana. Legalization and commercialization would allow for businesses to market and sell marijuana. And so that's the primary difference between the two.
So he's against marketing and selling marijuana. I'm in favor of it. I like going to the dispensary and buying my weed. because I don't want to have to buy it from a drug dealer.
A recent study reported higher rates of fatal car crashes in states that had legal recreational marijuana. We have to look at what are all the areas of society and of public health and safety that are going to be impacted through legalization and commercialization.
In fact, the study you cited looked at a subset of states. Even the authors of the studies acknowledge it may have nothing to do with the change in the status of marijuana at all, that there's a number of different confounders. Fortunately, we have real-world experience in this country, reducing rates of drunk driving. I am confident that we can continue to reduce rates of drug driving.
When you commercialize something, you have advertising, you have marketing, that increases use, that's what it's supposed to do. And when you have more people using, that percentage of people...
Hey chat, you know what more effectively gets you to not do something? Or at least for me, and I imagine this is true of most of you, you know what effectively gets me to, remember not to ever do something? Hearing true stories about that thing that I know verifiably are true. The more firsthand experience I have, the better. For example, I literally have known people in my life who've fallen deep and badly to drug addiction back from Florida. I mean, yeah, the stereotype, my Floridian schoolmates have grown up and a lot of them are deep in drug addiction now. But I saw what happened to them. And that's why I would never, even in my most experimental state, touch a pretty wide variety of drug substances. Not even to try or experiment with. Because I've seen what can happen firsthand. And it's not some scary PSA that's meant to scare kids. It was just witnessing and seeing verifiably the reality of where you can end up. Just the real shit. And to this day, it's worked. There's no, scary real shit like that with weed. I mean, I'm sure there's something, but, nicotine, I guess there is, but I already plan to quit nicotine. So, yeah, it's I don't know. I feel like... I feel like it's more realistic to get kids to not start smoking weed, to just explain the reality to them, not try to make up a boogeyman and scare kids,
that use irresponsibly is going to represent a larger number of people.
Do we know whether...
To be fair, this guy seems like he's a bit more good faith. I'm gonna take a guess that he's personally concerned about kids getting access to weed too young. I'm sure he's probably, got no problem with adults responsibly smoking weed, but he probably has a concern with young kids getting access to weed while they're in school, and it destroying their drive and motivation and possibly even sending them down the school-to-prison pipeline. I have a feeling he's concerned about that, but his motivations and, what he thinks is the solution to it is probably, is clearly different than what I think is the solution.
Use of marijuana goes up after legalization?
It tends to go up in people that are about 26, and so, yes.
The vision here is that we can craft policy with marijuana where we don't create something that creates a negative public health impact that we then have to address with massive campaigns afterwards.
My name's Paul Armentano. I always believe strongly.
I will also argue this isn't too much different, though the stakes are quite a bit lower, I would argue, than the arguments the right makes. The ones on the right who, or the ones who are being, convinced by the right that this is a valid argument, who are concerned about gender affirming care, and that certain situations where it has bad outcomes should completely negate the good situations where it helps people. Weed has been time and time again shown to have medicinal properties that help people. There are a lot of people that have been able to get off of prescription pills that are way worse, like opiates, like opiate prescription pills, in exchange for weed or CBD, which is a weed-derived compound, to help with their pain so that they don't have to take opiates. I have met several people in my life who no longer take Vicodin because they have weed. And obviously there's more studies and larger data that I could point to in regards to weed medicinal uses, but it's there, right? And while most people use weed recreationally rather than medicinally, I think the fact that so many people do get such great medicinal use out of it is good. A lot of people with PTSD get use out of marijuana. Some people, though, and this is where it can be an issue, like any medication that can affect your mind chemistry, weed can also have very negative effects on people with PTSD and whatnot. It can cause them to have panic attacks and freak the fuck out. And it can be a very bad time for them. But for some people, they can grow a dependency on it and literally rely on it as their medication. And I think if their dependence on it is as a medication to help with, like, a mental issue, I think that's fair. Obviously, with, you know, if it's prescribed by a therapist or a doctor, that's ideal. But, like, some people need it as like a crutch to get by. It's not ideal, but they need it.
In civil liberties, in a world that doesn't just accept alcohol, but celebrates the use of alcohol, it is unjust to be ruining people's lives over their use of a plant.
Yeah, the level to which our culture celebrates alcohol is pretty, like, it is very much, like, hypocritical. Like, if you have, like, no problem with alcohol, especially when you consider the fact that alcohol kills so many more people. Drunk driving, liver disease, like alcohol toxicity. Nobody, like, the people that are dying from weed at most are the much less common occasional DUI accidents that happen from weed. But even those are far less common than accidents that happen when you're drunk. Weed doesn't poison you. It's not like killing you bodily, except for, like, I guess smoking isn't really good for you, but it's not even as it's literally not as bad as cigarettes. So yeah, I feel like alcohol should be your top priority if you're going to try to be in favor of, like, some sort of policy changes in regards to that, right?
Police in the United States still make hundreds of thousands of low-level marijuana arrests every year. Over 90% of those arrests are for simple possession, and the results of these arrests are significant. People lose their jobs, people lose their professional licensure, their...
Oh, wait till you find out what their, like, standards are for what distribution or intent to distribute marijuana is. I found out from when FPS Russia, like, got federally charged and had his guns taken away because he's in Georgia and he had weed, that they found a text on his phone where he asked his girlfriend at the time, hey, you want to come over to my house and watch the new Game of Thrones and smoke some weed? They took that text, used it as evidence that he had intent to distribute marijuana, and were going to try to charge him as a drug dealer. Like, they were going to try to charge him as you would a drug dealer, like, years of time for that text. That's the standard by which they, especially with federal charges, like what he had, where it's, 97% conviction rate or something like that. Like, they have very, very low standards on what qualifies as distribution or intent to distribute when it comes to weed and other drugs.
Rights to vote, to possess a gun, subsidize housing. In some states, they even lose the right to adopt a child. And those arrested disproportionately are young people, poor people, and people of color.
So I'd agree 100% that there is systemic inequality and injustice in the way that the enforcement of marijuana laws has been carried out in our country. But when we look at the data from states that have legalized, we see that systemic inequality in law enforcement, even around the laws of legalization, continues to exist. We still continue to see disparities.
Absolutely.
Well, that's because driving under the influence is still illegal, and that's because we need police reform alongside this. These are not single issues, but the issue is once you've decriminalized possession of weed, at that point it's just a matter of, like, you don't need to be, like, as long as you're not stoned and driving, which you shouldn't be stoned and driving anyway because it's irresponsible and that's morally not a good thing to do, I would argue. Same as drunk driving. Even if it's not as dangerous as drunk driving, it's still, you're inhibiting yourself and getting behind heavy machinery. That's a moral wrong thing to do when you're on the road with other people. I like, that's a issue when it comes to, like, disparity with police pulling people over. Like, there's literally data that shows that at night, police like racial disparity and people getting pulled over goes away because cops can't see the race of the person driving the car. I forget what it's called, but it's got a nickname. There's the fact that, like, in cities that are mostly white, despite the fact that like white drivers are just as likely, if not more likely in some areas, to have weed on them, black people still get pulled over more. And when you account for the pullovers, not arrests, not actually finding drugs, they still get pulled over more when they're in like white areas, despite the fact those whiter areas, there are more white people there that are living there. They're more likely to have weed. And even then, the cops pull over more black people in those areas, and they don't end up having weed anywhere close to as often as white people driving around those areas that are predominantly white tend to have weed. It's a very clear disparity there. But the point is that you have to attack all of these issues simultaneously. It's not like a one issue, like one and done thing. That's why it's that's what intersectionality is. It's when you recognize that there are a bunch of different problems that like the symptoms of are all like intersecting to cause like one big amalgam of problems, right? So the weed criminalization is tied in intrinsically with police, like racial disparity in policing, right? Yeah, it's called the Veil of Darkness test. Thank you, BC2. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Nobody ever said legalizing cannabis was going to end systemic racism or even racism in policing. But it certainly removes a major tool from that toolbox. And we've seen in states that have legalized, total arrests for marijuana drop significantly.
On top of that, federal legalization of weed is also needed if we want to eliminate the racial disparity in regards, like, one of the ways that, like, I guess it almost seems like if you were to write a story about, like, justice happening on a cultural level, I would write the story arc as that, like, okay, you've got the unjust system that is, like, disproportionately arresting and convicting black people in America of possession of marijuana. Weed gets legalized on a federal level, ideally, or at least on a state level. And you start to be able to see at least some percentage of the black community see a socioeconomic, like, rebound due to that change. That hasn't happened because the way that weed has been legalized has resulted in the consolidation of like the resources, weed sales, all that good stuff. The actual, like, monetization of weed on a legal level is consolidated to white people. So white people were criminalizing black people smoking weed and possessing it at no different a rate than white people were. And then now that weed's legalized in certain places, white people are the ones that are controlling all of its sale, distribution, and taking all the money. Ideally, you would see federal legalization, at least some level of, like, a justice, a cultural, like, narrative justice would come around from it, right? But that has not happened yet. But federal legalization can be a big step in that direction. Federal legalization means banks can actually loan out to anyone who's got the credit to, like, take out a loan and start a weed dispensary and a weed business, no matter what their race. Although there are, of course, other injustices, but it'll be a big step. You know what I mean?
A 2017 survey found that 81% of marijuana business owners in the U.S. are white.
Yes,
This is a
that was
huge
the point. Okay, this is the point that I was making. The solution to this is federal legalization. Every single, like, aspiring black dispensary owner has said, I can't get my dispensary off the ground until weed is federally legalized. I need a loan from the bank. I don't have the money out of pocket to put down the capital necessary to start my own dispensary. I need a location. I need a place. I need, like, I need distribution lines. I need trucks. I need employees. Like, there's so much capital you have to put in to start the business before it becomes profitable. You need a loan. You can't get a loan until it's federally legalized. You have to be, for the most part, a rich white person to start a dispensary in these legal states. Federal legalization is the solution. Decriminalization and legalization, both.
Contrast to the people that are most often talked about when we hear about marijuana legalization, which is entrepreneurs of color and in reinvesting in communities harmed by the war on drugs. That's a great idea, but that's
What the solution? Yeah, he's calling out the thing. That's literally what I just said, and I just already got out ahead of him and said the solution is federal legalization, so the banks can loan. I'm literally running like I'm ahead of him.
It's not the reality of how it's panning out at all. The other concern is that the placement of marijuana businesses is disproportionately in communities of color, just like we see with liquor stores.
We all want to see greater inclusion.
Exactly. Yes, it is literally white people who have almost entire, like a monopoly on the marijuana industry in these legal states that are funneling funds specifically targeted at black communities, but there is also, as we know, like white people smoke weed about as much as black people, if not more, in most parts of the country. So you're still getting like white people going to those dispensaries, but functionally, when you look at it on a map, and on paper, it's a bunch of white people consolidating this industry and funneling money from black communities into their own like white-owned business that they already had the capital for in the first place to start because they didn't need a loan.
In the commercial marijuana industry. Of course, one of the reasons we don't have that diversity now is because the federal law treats cannabis as a Schedule I controlled substance, which means that banks and other financial institutions will not provide lending, will not provide loans to these would-be entrepreneurs to allow them to get their foot in the door. In fact, we have a potential fix, the Safe Banking Act. But your organization, Will, opposes that change in federal policy, which would help remedy this very situation.
Yeah.
Ooh. Let's see if the fact checker agrees. Let's see if the fact checker jumps in and calls out like something there being wrong. But I saw a pop-up there and it seemed like it was agreeing there. I wonder what his retort will be.
Yeah, and I think that's because the Safe Banking Act would open the floodgates to huge tobacco companies and alcohol companies totally taking over the industry. And it's a great idea that we want to have smaller entrepreneurs get into this, but we know how business works in the US. We know how capitalism works. On multiple fronts, we're going to continue to see this inequality exist.
Wait, so it should just be banned? Like, so it shouldn't be allowed? That we should just allow this disparity to continue? Like, it's already the big companies that are getting into weed already because they have the money to start it off. That makes no sense. Large corporations like the alcohol companies and tobacco companies don't need money and funds and capital from banks and loans to start dispensaries. They just have the funds to do that if they want to break into that industry. What? How did you just use capitalism as an argument against legalized weed? So right now, there is massive disparity. That change would heavily, like, take a hit to that disparity, but he argues that something that is already happening now would happen more with, like, large corporations getting into weed. This makes no sense. That is the most illogical argument I've heard from him. Like, that makes no fucking sense. The reason why POC, like, communities are having a harder time breaking into the weed industry in legal states is because they don't have the money and resources that these large corporations have. They are claiming because of this... Okay.
Decriminalization leaves the unregulated marketplace intact, and it continues to perpetuate police interaction with the community.
It shouldn't have to perpetuate law enforcement.
I'm sorry. Nobody is going to be getting their weed illegally if they can get it legally easier. This is even true of pirating. We know this has always been true. There's no reason why I would ever go to some guy to get my weed when I can go to the dispensary. There's just that's just a fact. The stuff at the dispensary is better. It's going to be cheaper for the quality. There's just no reason. There is no reason if there's a dispensary and it is available. And he's against the dispensaries. So you literally don't have to use like legal response by criminalizing people. Like, there won't be an industry in selling weed if everybody has access to dispensaries. There's no industry in selling illegal milk in America because everybody can go to the store and buy milk. If everyone can go to the store and buy weed, there's not going to be an industry of illegal weed. If everyone can go to a clinic and get an abortion, there's not going to be an industry of unsafe, illegal abortions. Because people don't seek out the subpar illegal version of something if there is a legal, better version of it at their fingertips.
I think that we can craft decriminalization in a way that completely removes it from the criminal justice system and treats it more as a health issue. I think like Portugal has done a great job at destigmatizing use and for people to have problematic use to have services provided for them.
When you say that if decriminalization perpetuates law enforcement contact with marijuana users and sellers, can you explain why that would be? If it's not a crime, why are the police involved?
Because marijuana is illicit, which means it's contraband. So if the police encounter somebody...
Well, what it means is that, well, yeah, he's going to explain it here, but it's like if you're driving or if you're like, if a cop stops you or something and you're under the influence of the substance, that can be an issue. They can say you're under illicit substances.
Possessing or using cannabis, they have a legal responsibility to interact, to seize that cannabis. They also can continue to search individuals, pull them over, frisk them because they claim they smelled cannabis. Because again, cannabis itself is an illicit substance. Now,
how many innocent black people do you think have been pulled over by cops who said they smelled weed? Wink, wink. Imagine being able to take away the "I thought I smelled weed" excuse from cops. Like, they literally can't use that as an excuse to pull people over anymore. There's a lot of, like, videos and blogs and stuff like that. They're usually called something along the lines of, like, driving while black or whatever. There's a lot of excuses that cops will use to, like, racially profile black people on the road and pull them over because they don't want to seem racist, I guess. I always love taking away another reason they try to use to validate their racial profiling. So I think taking away that excuse would be a good one.
not a legal one.
And if a decriminalization law allows for that, then it's a poorly crafted decriminalization law.
Will, it sounds like you want Washington, D.C. People can possess marijuana, they can grow marijuana, but there's no regulated commercial market for people to obtain marijuana. And that's why we have unregulated shops gifting marijuana products, selling unregulated products.
Also, if you keep it banned, you're just going to see more things like DMT, for example. Or not DMT, like, well, obviously you're going to see DMT and other drugs become popular. Not DMT, that's a hallucinogen, which is pretty cool. What's it called? It's got a similar name. Delta 8. It's got a similar name. Delta 8. You're going to see Delta 8. You're going to see Spice. You're going to see Delta 10. You're going to see fucking... what else is there? There's so many different, like, alternate versions of weed, some better than others that have come along. Like, God, you're going to see, like, there's so many different types. Spice is horrible, apparently. THCP, HHC is apparently a thing. THCO, I've tried that. It's pretty good. It's actually pretty strong. HHC and HHCO. Like, there's so many different hemp-derived, like, cannabinoids that people are going to find loopholes through. It's just, like, people want to get their hands on weed, and they'd rather order it online legally through a legal loophole, even, than go to get real weed from a drug dealer. Nobody wants to have to get their weed illegally. The criminal distribution and industry behind weed will collapse within days if weed gets legalized federally. As soon as everybody's got access to a dispensary within reason, that'll be where they go. People will go out of state to go to their closest dispensary instead of to their local drug dealer, if it becomes legal for them to go over, get it, and just, like, have it.
Is that a preferable policy to one where the commercial market is licensed and regulated?
I do think it's preferable, but I think that is because the shops came into place with the understanding that eventually it would be commercialized. Even more ideally, we create a new world, a new concept where it's like, hey, grow this yourself, or if you want to have it and share it with friends, do that. But this is not something that we're going to allow industries to sell.
He's trying to go super libertarian with it and say, if you want weed, you have to grow it yourself. I'm sorry, you're not taking away my lab fucking my lab gene spliced GMO super weed that's been genetically engineered for years and will continue to be so, to become stronger and stronger and stronger, and then distilled and concentrated down into this convenient vape pen. Which, by the way, I don't think you could make these vape pens at home. I'm sorry. Fuck this libertarian. Oh, you have to. Not even libertarian. It's more like Anprim. You have to grow it yourself. No businesses are allowed to start based on this thing. You have to grow it in your own yard. Christ. I mean, that's fun. I mean, I do like people doing home growing if that's what they want to do, and I think that should be allowed, but I think most people would rather just go to the store and pick up their vape pen and go home and stream.
Big tobacco and alcohol companies have invested billions of dollars into the cannabis industry and are lobbying for legalization at the federal and state levels.
The reason for this is because the cigarette and alcohol markets are dying in the place of vapes and weed. With the legalization of weed and the introduction of vapes, the rate of smoking goes down massively and the rate of drinking goes down massively. Respectively. This has meant that these large companies have had to start moving their actual market more towards these other substances because they see that cigarettes and alcohol are a dying industry compared to weed and vapes. Now, I would say that is a good thing. It's like Hasbro going from selling weapons to selling toys. Sure, still kind of fucked up that was a thing, but I'm glad they're selling toys and not weapons now. They might still be selling weapons, though. I actually don't know. But yeah, I think that was a thing. I think Hasbro literally was a weapons manufacturer before they made toys. Or it was some, toy-making company that used to be a weapons manufacturer. It might not have been Hasbro. Regardless, this is just these companies adapting to the fact that when weed is an option and vapes are an option, instead of smoking cigarettes and drinking liquor, people would rather have a joint and a vape. And that's not a perfect way to treat your body, but it's clearly healthier than cigarettes and liquor.
And this is especially concerning because we know the track.
And the fact that people are actively choosing to seek out the better option here should be encouraged. They're not being it's not being banned and they're having to find an alternative. They're actively choosing what they believe is the better option. People like vapes and weed better than they like liquor and cigarettes.
Record that these companies have of addiction for profit, whether we're talking about alcohol or the tobacco industries, it raises some concerns for public health that I think are very important.
Certainly, there are commercial interests, but to imply that they are the ones driving this train is simply disingenuous. This is an issue that was largely pushed on the grassroots level 20, 30 years ago, and it remains the grassroots level that's pushing this issue today.
Yep.
Not corporations, not big business.
Corporations responding to the public wanting something is not evidence that only corporations want it. This is a very common conservative, what's the word for it? Conservatives will very oftentimes, they do it with the go woke, go broke, or the woke agenda thing, where it's look, the left or LGBT people can't be discriminated against. People of color can't be discriminated against. Look at how many large corporations do Pride Month posts or do months during or do a big post during Black History Month and stuff like that. Clearly, these groups aren't oppressed if all these big, powerful companies publicly, announce their support for these groups, right? The fact that the public has influenced these companies does not mean the companies made up these ideas. They try to claim that wokeness is a corporate thing, but it's companies doing what sells best to the public. That's literally all it is.
But in fact, the people.
Whoever's pushed this for 20 years, at the end of the day, there's big tobacco and alcohol companies standing.
Oh, is Mattel? Apparently it was Mattel, and maybe not Hasbro. I don't know. It was some company that used to make toys that ended up, or that makes toys that used to be a arms manufacturer. Maybe the other way around.
By ready to profit
Google
off
it.
of that, and that's a big concern.
Mattel made M16 rifles. Oh shit.
I think Will's proposed solutions, policies like decriminalization, don't go far enough. Because at the end of the day, if we don't want criminal entrepreneurs being the ones providing cannabis, if we want purity of products, if we want products that are labeled and regulated, then we have to have legalization. Because we can't impose regulations and rules on a decriminalized substance.
What this discussion has showed is that we need to move past.
He meant to say criminalized. We can't enforce rules and regulations on a criminalized substance because all the distribution and industry is illegal and under the radar of the police and the government to begin with. You can regulate and like manage an industry that is legal and public. And there will not be an illegal industry when it's all public and legal because people rather get it legally than illegally. So he meant illegal, not legalized.
The punitive policies that we've had for marijuana in the past years in our country, while still avoiding the excesses of commercialization. What you see from continued habitual use for heavy users, that's where you start to see the negative public health costs, whether that's on.
So now he's trying to argue that the people are wrong in their support for having, like, weed legalization. Or, like, they're wrong in their support for that because it's actually not healthy for you. Okay. There are a lot of things that aren't healthy for you that you have the freedom to do in this country. You have the freedom to climb a tree and swing from a rope into a spring. I've done this before many times. Could have died doing it. If I did that with the intent of killing myself, it would be illegal. Suicide's illegal. Attempted suicide's illegal. But because I did it with the intent of having fun, it wasn't illegal. And I didn't get hurt, thankfully. Like, you're allowed and free to do a lot of things in this country that are dangerous and bad for you. What matters, I believe, unironically, is whether or not, if you're doing something that's bad for you but you enjoy it, whether or not it affects others negatively. And smoking weed and, just particularly weed, it generally isn't harming others. And if it is harming others, then it's usually illegal for other reasons. Like, for example, let's say you're a parent and marijuana smoking is causing you to be a lackluster parent. Chances are the thing you're doing that should be illegal is child neglect or child abuse, not smoking weed and having a kid, right? So, like, the things that you consider would be a problem are already illegal. So why does the substance need to be an issue? Because the substance being a legal issue is always going to be causing completely well-meaning, well-acting people to get fucked over.
On driving, whether that's on mental health, whether that's on youth use, we have to move forward in a way that isn't going to allow for the exploitation of vulnerable communities by addiction-for-profit companies.
Let's cut.
I do think there is an ethical argument to be made that addiction-for-profit companies are, like, some of the most disgusting examples of, like, capitalist industry. But I would, like, retort to that with, no, the most disgusting form of capitalist industry is necessities for profit. The fact that you have to, like, the fact that you go to the store and you have to buy water. Like, obviously you can run your tap, but you have to pay your water bill in a lot of places. A lot of places don't have access to clean drinking water. Flint, Michigan, for example. So you have to buy water from the store. Food, you have to buy. Housing is commodified. These are things you need to live. Like, you don't have them and you'll die. Addictions are wants. Sure, there are some addictions that you can get hooked on that you'll die if you go cold turkey, like alcohol, for example. And that's pretty fucked. That's why I think alcohol, so many people moving from alcohol to weed, when alcohol can kill you if you get addicted and go cold turkey, is like, I rather they be addicted to weed than alcohol, you know? God, it's so deep, yeah. Like, alcohol is an exception to this, but, like, when it comes to, like, addiction, it's stuff that you want, and that's commodified, and that's bad, sure, addiction for profit. But what about, like, living for profit? Like, you have to, like, provide profit to corporations to survive, or go out in the woods and hunt for yourself, I guess, or forage. I don't know. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about it.